What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Shou-Lao has begun to occupy a place at the top of the metagame in a couple of different respects. The biggest thing that Shou-Lao does is be hard enough to interact with for typical mid-range decks, such that it doesn't really have any competitors as the ceiling of what a mid-range deck can be. In other words, every mid-range deck doesn't have good enough interaction to make up for the difference in points between themselves and Shou-Lao. This has led to a dramatic decrease in the amount of Victoria Hand, of move mid-range without Shou-Lao. All of those decks are finding themselves falling further and further behind as the Shou-Lao decks manage to reinvent themselves and reclassify themselves and figure out various other shells that they can hybridize themselves into. This is the basic shell of Shou-Lao, and it's the one that I've been playing the most of. Really, what I go back and forth on is whether I want Jocasta or Copycat to maximize my disruption. The reason I prefer this iteration of it, give or take Jocasta for a Copycat, is that one of the things Shou-Lao has done by being effectively a sort of bounce-esque combo deck, where its output is quite high, but it's also quite difficult to interact with, and there are still decks that go over the top of it, is create a metagame where a lot of decks are combo decks trying to have more points than Shou-Lao. So this sort of disruption style of the deck is good not just in a world where you care about disrupting your opponent's Shou-Laos, but also disrupting other combo decks. And I do think that that is the right way to phrase it. Other combo decks. Shou-Lao is a combo deck. The metagames we've been in that are like this before are metagames like Hela-defined metagames, Bounce-defined metagames, where there is something at the top of the mid-range decks pushing them all downward and making it so interaction isn't particularly profitable to play, except in cases like this. So you have this as a deck that is relatively good at dealing with opposing Shou-Laos, thanks to all of the interactive pieces it has, and also good at dealing with combo decks thanks to those same interactive pieces. The other direction you can go with Shou-Lao is optimizing for the mirror by virtue of just having a better deck in mid-rangey games. Because if you're going to be playing a Shou-Lao deck and both of you are going to be doing what you want to do, having a deck that has the rest of their cards being a better points package can be a meaningful advantage in a pseudo mirror. This is what Iris has been playing, the move mid-range list spliced with Shou-Lao and Maverick. Now, this is the other major denomination of Shou-Lao that you're going to see. The disruption-heavy Jocasta version, and this, which is much more focused on being a powerful mid-range deck that just wins on point distribution and really efficient threats. It is notable that I would really love if we were able to fit something like a Madam Web in here. We can't, but I want to, so I have more game into the various Man-Spider combo decks with something like Cosmo Madam Web. The deck is pretty tight on the cards that it is able to play, so it is not a lot of availability in terms of changes that you have access to here. This is very much two really good decks being mashed together, and sometimes that means you lose out on a couple of the interactive pieces that you would otherwise love to have if you were playing either of the decks separately. This is probably the Shou-Lao deck that is best at beating other Shou-Lao decks if both of you are not disrupted, because it just does a better mid-range game plan than the disruption-heavy combo deck. But it is a little bit reliant on, let's say, a Cosmo hitting the right stuff if you want to deal with how everyone else is trying to attack Shou-Lao, which is to say, going over the top. As far as going over the top, the first deck that comes to mind is Man-Spider. And the biggest reason it comes to mind rather than many of the other combo decks like Zombie Galacti or Living Tribunal is that Man-Spider is basically the only combo deck that has enough backup energy sources that it is able to not be a magic deck. And that is a really valuable position when every Shou-Lao deck is playing Merlin. So you need to be able to not be reliant on magic, to go over the top as high as you possibly can, and to generally just make things awkward for your opponents. This deck can only really exist, though, thanks to Shou-Lao squashing so much of interactive midrange, right? Like, this is a deck that is deeply weak to Shadow King. It doesn't really have the ability to play through that kind of stuff. It is very much just like, I'm going to make a really big guy, and then I'm going to blow up that really big guy, and I'm going to revive that really big guy. And it's like, well, that loses to a Shadow King on multiple lanes. It can get got by Cosmos even, although that's a little bit iffier. But just generally, the fact that Shadow King is so bad against Shou-Lao has made this deck a lot more easily runnable. And that is a really notable thing. Like, this is a very extremely noticeable thing that has happened, is because of what Shou-Lao has done to squash interactive midrange decks, in much the same way as Hela used to do, what it has done is create a metagame where it's really just about making the biggest points possible, and your opponent probably can't interact with them, because why would they be playing the interactive cards that actually work? Because they don't work against Shou-Lao. There's so much of that. And that is what this deck is benefiting from. I think a slightly more enduring version of the archetype is the one I did a video on yesterday with Cougar, the Pixie and Fallen One version of this. I'm also pretty excited to get the new Season Pass card in February, Star-Lord Master of the Sun, into here as a sort of backup Fallen One. I think that will be a big boost to this deck's viability, frankly. But generally speaking, what this deck is trying to do, again, is just combo off without being a magic deck, and this deck is much more able to deal with various interactive pieces by doing its entire combo on the final turn of the game. When Man Spider first came out, I said that we were probably, like, it might not be the best card ever right now, but at some point I would not be surprised if it was going to be doing something really busted, and we are at that point. Man Spider is a deck that, now that we have really nailed down how to play the list, this is a deck that can combo you off with 13 energy on the final turn of the game, and you will not beat it. You absolutely will not even come close. And that is a really powerful place for a deck to be. It is one of the few combo decks that can get maximum output in this game and not be a magic deck. It is an important space for it to be in. If I were betting on which of the two to play now, I think maybe the first version is a little bit better. But if I were betting on which of the two has legs for a long period of time, I would be betting on this one. Zombie Galacti's only real weakness is a general difficulty of play, which is honestly a bit of a weird thing to say, but there are just a lot of things to think about in terms of prioritization here. It's not necessarily like a hard deck to play, but you're going to have to play a little bit before you actually understand what it's asking of you, because it's asking so many different things from you than a normal deck would. This is also a deck that has a couple of really inbuilt weaknesses. Like, if people are going to start Cosmoing you, I've seen people playing Eliath out of ramp lists. Like, there are things that can get you big time, but generally speaking, the thing that's going to get you the most is that you're a limbo deck. Like, that's really the biggest thing preventing this from being the best deck in the game, probably, is that it really cares about being a limbo deck. Every single piece of Zombie Galacti cares so deeply about that turn 7. The extra draw you get, because of course you want to play as many cards before Zombie Galacti as you can. The 7 energy, this deck really wants that. And so, as much as I wish I could be something that isn't a magic deck, I don't think I can, so we're just playing the normal Zombie Galacti list. This is, again, just an output game. The output here is really big if you're able to pull off what you're trying to do. It's actually a little bit undynamic in terms of snaps and retreats, because I don't think anybody in the world has ever stayed into a turn 7 from this deck. It just simply doesn't happen. Your opponents are just going to be like, oh, I can count Zombie Galacti. That's 14. I guess I'm leaving. Like, that is a really constant thing with this deck, where the dynamic is basically either they're going to beat you big or you're going to win small. And that dynamic's not great, but it is sort of inherent to a lot of combo decks, which is what a lot of the metagame has to be, because Shou-Lao is squashing midrange so hard. If you're looking for, like, the sort of fairer or like throwback combo deck in this metagame, some form of ongoing combo is a very solid bet. Now, this deck has multiple ways to do multiple stupid things, but a lot of it is just going to be, I'm going to Living Tribunal, my point total is going to be like 40 in every lane, and Shou-Lao is not going to beat that, right? that's kind of the baseline of what this deck is trying to do. It is also, unfortunately, to me, a tier 2 of the combo decks, where tier 1 is Man Spider, and the only thing that is really differentiating Man Spider from these lists, the Tribunal list that we're looking at here and the previous list that we talked about, is literally just that these two have to be Magic decks. That is the only thing, but it matters that much. And I think that this is a deck that is legitimately just a very reasonable, solid choice. I would call it like a third place behind the Man Spider list and the Zombie Galacti list, but it really is like a legitimate third place, not like a, oh, let me just throw some crumbs to the free-to-play players. Like, this is, no, it's a deck. It's a real deck. And I think that that is a meaningful thing. Like, this is not just like, oh, it's an honorable mention. Like, no, you're going to beat some Shou-Lao gamers with this. You actually will do that. It does do the job that you're signing up for here. A little bit of Hela gaming never hurt anybody, at least since Stardust released, and this is where Denish is at on his current iteration of Hela. It is a little bit metagamed against people playing Stardust, although frankly, I've noticed a whole lot less of that in recent weeks. Like, it was a big thing last week was like, let's try Stardust to beat these mirrors, and it just sort of... It turns out if you're playing a Stardust deck and your opponent's playing like the move Shou-Lao deck, you just eat it. Like, you just absolutely eat it. And it's been a little bit on the way out, I would say. This is definitely a list that is still respecting it, though. Enchantress in the list does respect Stardust pretty greatly. And, of course, Giganto in the list over Infinaut is also respecting Stardust. What it's saying is you will be a ramp deck some of the time. You'll be a turn 5 Giganto, turn 6 Fin Fang Foom off Corvus Glaive. That's what you're going to be doing a decent amount of the time. It will happen that way. Or a turn 5 Giganto, turn 6 Gambit Ghost Rider. All that stuff, very viable, very possible. That kind of stuff will happen, and it is sort of how this deck is built. This is a ramp Hela deck, a Hela ramp deck. They are both important pieces of what this deck is trying to do, and the output is pretty straightforwardly powerful. Fin Fang Foom has become a pretty interesting card in the wake of Man Spider becoming a really big thing, because against some of the Man Spider decks, this is like an amazing card, priority depending. Like, you can just be an app, like a tech card almost against Man Spider, and that's a really powerful thing to be. And against, sometimes if you do the priority wrong, it'll just not do anything at all in that matchup, and that's a really interesting dynamic. It's an interesting card, and it's a surprising amount of depth for a big dumb idiot card. Speaking of big dumb idiots, this is probably my favorite deck in the game right now. It is powerfully tier 2. Like, there is no argument that this is a tier 1 deck, in my humble opinion. But I do just love playing it. It's a really simple, really straightforward, really fun deck to play. I keep going back and forth on, specifically, there are two cards in here, Legion and Dragon Lord, comparing to Cosmic Ghost Rider. And I'm like pretty sure that Dragon Lord is supposed to be Cosmic Ghost Rider. I would say I'm like 70% sure. But I really like playing this version. I'm sorry. But I want to be like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, like, I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be CGR here, just so you have more game into the various Shou-Lao decks that may leave an exposed Maverick or an exposed Spider out there for your CGR to get. I do think that you just kind of need that edge, because you're definitely not favored in those matchups. Like, you can win them, but it requires a couple of things to go right for you and a couple of things to go wrong for them a lot of the time. And that's viable. Like, you can play for that. It's not like you're good, like always losing them. It's just like they're probably like 55% in the matchup, and that's not a great space to be in. I really do love playing this list, but it is caught between a rock and a hard place where you're not positive it's actually beating Shou-Lao, and it's definitely not beating a Man Spider. I've seen a lot of people sort of push versions of this with like Goliath in them, so you have outs to the Man Spider stuff. I do think that's cool. I just don't think it's consistent, and I wouldn't want to, like, I'd rather just retire the deck until Man Spider goes away than do what you have to do to try to win that matchup. Maybe it works. Like, I'm not necessarily 100% out on it. It seems like it'd be pretty good in both of those matchups, or at least give you some cope stays in those matchups. But I really do like the top-end suite that we have access to here, and becoming a sort of like small ball, ooh, I'm going to Cosmic Ghost Rider and then Goliath. It's like, aren't they just going to beat me by playing cards? Like, don't I just lose to numbers on the board if I start doing things like that? I don't know. I think it's possible, but you are going to be hampered by the relatively poor stat lines of the interactive cards that this deck can play, and that's real. And I think that this is also just a generally strong list that is relying on power output. It's just not in a great position right now, thanks to the prevalence of both Shou-Lao, who can beat you, even though, like, that's not how you want mid-range matchups to go. You have a mid-rangey deck that is definitely strong enough to just outpower you. It's bad for this deck. And then a bunch of combo decks where it's like, oh, that's, like, quite good against me. Like, they can combo me out of the game. It's not a great meta for ramp. I'm playing it anyway, but I'm not going to sit here and gaslight you and tell you this is the greatest time to do this. I'm putting this list on here as a representative of like a various group of Cerebro decks where I kind of think that like a lot of Cerebro stuff is secretly pretty good right now. Like you could play C5 and I wouldn't call that embarrassing. And I think even just like base C3 without the Galactus scam is interesting. But when you talk about what Galactus brings to a list like this, it's largely just like, look, these Shou-Lao decks are playing for 3 lanes really hard. And if you can just make them not be able to do that, Galactus can just win the game. Like that kind of stuff where you're just like, I've set up my giant Maverick with a Cerebro buff and it just like gives my Galactus 18 power or whatever. That kind of stuff. Like if you have Jocasta Maverick with a Cerebro setting up Galactus, like that kind of stuff, it's not happening all the time, but it's helpful. Like you just have the ability to do some reasonably dumb stuff and prevent your opponent from doing a lot of the powerful things that they would want to do to attack 3 lanes. But also, as a Cerebro deck, you are really damn good at attacking 3 lanes. You are extremely, extremely potent at being just a great points deck. You know, people talk about Shou-Lao. You can't have anything that says +3 on it. I think that's a pretty terrible way to look at it. Like a lot of the time, like I think it's very reductive. I'm going to take a minute to talk about this because I see people saying that they're like, oh, they can't put +3 on anything. And it's like, well, no, it just can't be that free. Shou-Lao's problem is that the +3 is easily duplicatable and very free to trigger, right? But there are definitely clearly ways to put a bunch of +3s on a card that aren't broken, or at least people won't complain about to the same degree. And Cerebro is a great example of that. Like, Cerebro says +3 to your entire board, and you can copy it pretty easily. It's like a really powerful card, but the restrictions on it are very pronounced. And I think that goes to show that, like, you can fix Shou-Lao by putting restrictions on him rather than just saying, oh, he has to be +2 because Galacta had to be +2. I really do think that the sort of mental tick that the Snap community has about the numbers +3 is genuinely like it's like group psychosis. Like I genuinely think that it's just like it's an easy thing to say and people just sort of made up a rule that's like, this is just a fact, right? And it's like, well, no, you just have to put strong enough gates on it. Cerebro says +3. Morgan Le Fay says +3. These are not broken cards. Like it is very easy actually to make a card that sucks and says this, I think. Look at Morgan, right? Like this card is terrible. You can do it. It's about ease of access to the power. Galacta asked you to play a card. Access was too easy. I would argue Shou-Lao, access is too easy. But I just really want people to understand this as a problem of both inputs and outputs. Because I think people shortcut to just looking at the output. They're like, oh, +3, that's busted. It's not how it works. The output has to be commensurately gated by the input. What makes Shou-Lao and previous Galacta so strong is that there wasn't enough gate on them. Or there isn't enough gate on them. And that is a really important concept to learn, and I just really hope people actually take that away from this video. The tier 2 mid-range decks are largely the same, but they're largely even more tier 2 because for some reason, the best interaction that a Shou-Lao deck can play is like Spider-Ham and Iceman. And guess what's really good against a V-hand deck? Like, the best interaction in the game is basically 1, and then the text is make a scalar in your opponent's hand suck, right? And so if you're playing like a V-hand deck or an Invisible One First Steps deck, like, these cards really matter to you. Like, what your cards are, they matter a ton. You're getting them whacked by pigs and iced by men, and it's just a whole thing where it's like part of what makes Shou-Lao good is that it's numbers checking these decks. And I agree that it does successfully numbers check these decks, but it's also the interaction stuff. The other thing going on here that I think is pretty important to note is that one of the things that really keeps me from saying Destroy is a good deck a lot of the time is access to power rather than the number on the card. And it's actually the same concept we just talked about with like the +3s, where it's like what makes Destroy a bit of a bad deck compared to other combo decks is that other combo decks don't have to draw their stuff as early and therefore have more access to their nut draws. And I think Shou-Lao is a great example. You just have to draw Shou-Lao by turn 6, right? Like that's all you really have to do. The rest of it is just playing Marvel Snap, right? With Destroy, your best draws are going to be bigger than Shou-Lao, but they happen like 10% of the time because you have to draw Agony and Deadpool and all of that stuff. And that dynamic, I think, actually maps onto what Shou-Lao has done to these mid-range decks, where it simply just has access to more power more easily, more of the time. Shou-Lao's nut draw is more forgiving than V-Hand's nut draw. Because what do you need for V-Hand's nut draw to happen? Well, you need a V-Hand and you need a Frigga, and you need to be able to play them before turn 6, and you need to be able to play them in order, and you need to not be giving up other stuff to make that happen. Like, it's a lot harder to access the maximum output of this deck than it is to access the maximum output of a Shou-Lao deck. It just is. And so you end up with these decks all becoming like the Destroy to Shou-Lao's actual metagame version of the mid-rangey decks, right? Like that's what ends up happening here. And that, I think, again, like when I talk about, like when I do these videos, I do want to teach you guys stuff if I can. And I think the biggest thing you can learn about Marvel Snap and card games in general from this is that it's not just about the numbers you can do. It's about the reliability of those numbers, and it's about your access to those numbers across a large number of hands, a large number of games. How often are you accessing your best draws? And what makes Shou-Lao so good is that he is accessing his best draws almost all the time. You just have to have him. Ongoing is a deck I actually think is like full stop underrated. And I feel like I say this every week, but like this deck just does points really efficiently, really well. It gets to play Gorgon. Gorgon is amazing against Merlins. Merlin is a big part of Shou-Lao decks. Like, yeah, you know, sometimes you get got. I get it. But you can legitimately outpower a Shou-Lao deck with this. Again, though, it's a question of access, right? Like, this is a deck that really falls apart if it doesn't have a 2-drop on 2. If it is skipping turns 1 and 2, it is the worst thing you've ever seen. You are accessing certain amounts of power irregularly, right? Like you have, you know, Moonstone, you Iron Man somewhere, you Mystique the Iron Man on the Moonstone, you play something big. That'll work, but it requires a lot of you. Again, the point here is access to your best draws, access to your games where you have more power than Shou-Lao. And part of what makes Shou-Lao good is that even though this deck probably can do more power, it doesn't do it often enough to really displace Shou-Lao at the top end. But I do think that if you're looking for a deck that just has game into basically everything, there are so many combo decks that just will not respect you if you do this. And they should, because you can make like 80 power Moonstone lanes. Like you can outpower a zombie Galacti here. You can be one of the few decks that meaningfully contests Man Spider. Like that kind of stuff is real in this deck. If anything, I almost feel like this is a deck that just like it doesn't get to run all the cards it would want to run, right? Like I want to get a Cosmo in here really badly, but I just don't think I can, so I have to just go full point output here, which is part of what Iron Lad is doing. Unfortunately, I do think that the old version of the Iris deck has been notably outdone by the Maverick and Shou-Lao inclusion in it. It's just a little too free to get those cards in there. But I do think this deck is still really good. It's just unfortunate that fusing Shou-Lao with it ended up being the optimal thing to do with it rather than building to beat the matchup. Turns out it's just better if we're going to be Shou-Laoing. One card I really don't think I've seen enough of is the card Hope Summers. And heart of the cards is Shou-Lao Surferless Surfer deck. Is honestly pretty damn solid at using Hope Summers specifically. Like if you're playing Shou-Lao Mirrors, one really powerful thing to do is just be the Hope Summers deck. You just have more cards. You have more power. You have more things. You do more stuff. You have bigger numbers. And that's how you win these mirrors. It's a really legitimate thing to do. The Prodigy stuff is also all kind of insane. Like, have you ever Prodigied a Maverick? That's pretty busted. Did you know that if Maverick has used its ability and you Prodigy it, you get the Maverick activate? So if, for example, you have a Maverick in the front row in the first slot, you play another card, let's say a Kitty Pryde, then you activate your Maverick onto the Prodigy you play behind the Maverick, that's a 7-power Maverick that you have just created. Like, all of this kind of stuff just adds up. It's just good. Big Baby and Butt have been working on this Moon Girl pile, and it's a pretty solid deck. It's good at throwing priority and having a lot of power. It has a Shadow King to deal with the Man Spider stuff, so that's a pretty good thing to do. The goal here is really explicitly, though, throw priority, play some really big guys. Between Fin Fang Foom and Shadow King, you actually have a pretty good Man Spider matchup. Your Warlock is going to make stuff as cheap as it can possibly get. You do some really legitimately strong stuff in this deck when you manage to make it work. I am less than sold on the Isan stuff, but it is nice to say, let's get a bunch of crap out of our hand. Isan is dragging down a Fin Fang Foom. We also have a couple of She-Hulks. That's a winning play. You can absolutely go that direction with it. I think it's a really interesting deck that does some legitimately powerful things that is probably being overlooked in this metagame. And I do think that it's nice to be one of the few decks that gets to be a Fin Fang Foom and Shadow King list in a world where Man Spider is as prominent as it is. Jay Walla, meanwhile, has been playing Fairishem, or as I like to call it at this point, Fairishem. This is actually genuinely the best fair mid-range deck in the game, in as much as Fairishem ever will be fair. It's just a pile of various interactive pieces. What I like about this deck specifically, though, is that it's probably the best deck in the game at utilizing Negasonic, which is just an absolutely unbelievable card into the Shou-Lao decks that are looking for, like, Man Spiders and things of that nature. Really, really powerful interactive tool, especially if you can dictate where they're able to play. The rest of what this deck is doing is normal Fairishem stuff, just good cards, Iron Patriots, things that stack, things that are going to allow you to cheat energy, things that are very large. You know the deal. When the card Shou-Lao first came out, in my Discord, Fox, the Golden Gauntlet winner, ran a poll that was like, which of these cards does Shou-Lao cuck the most? And Null was one of the options, and it turns out that's actually just, like, legitimately a thing. This is a deck. It is, of course, Destroy. It does as much as you possibly can for, like, I don't know what it means that Shou-Lao is probably making this deck better. I mean, I do know what it means. It means you got to nerf Shou-Lao. But, like, we are at the point where, this deck's play pattern does actually match with Shou-Lao pretty well. Destroy is very, very, very rarely actually only playing one card a turn, so it just naturally gets, like, pretty good Shou-Lao stuff. Like, you're able to just do a lot of, like, ooh, here's a bunch of ones. Here's a 1 and a thing that blows it up. Here's a 1 and a thing that blows it up. Like, you're very rarely actually not getting, like, 12 power on your Shou-Lao. And it turns out that, like, big Shou-Lao, Death, Deadpool, that's actually just like a pretty good final turn. You're just pretty happy with that. And it allows you to just generally do powerful stuff in ways that people aren't necessarily expecting. It plays against type, where a lot of people who play against this deck expect, like, one big null to come down and that to be, like, one unlosable lane. And so they spread across all three. And it's like, you can play against the way people typically play against Destroy by including Shou-Lao in the deck. And I mean, hey, it's the end of the tier list. You know we had to get a Destroy gamer on here. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe. I forgot to remind you at the beginning of the video, and I will see you in the next one.